restarting our series, our semester, with a spectacular guest today, because some of the things that Stephan Curry is involved on a day-to-day basis has been very much object of what we have been talking about here and elsewhere. So it is a great pleasure that we today have the talk by Stephan Curry, How Can Good Research Be Evaluated? I'll say a few words about him in a second, but first want to introduce our commentator for today, which is Marta Sienkiewicz. And she will be commenting on Stephan's talk after it's through, and then we will discuss, as usual, the questions by the students and all the other questions that that might come up. So Marta Sienkiewicz is a PhD candidate and a member of the Science and Evaluation Studies Research Group at the CWTS in Leiden. And she has worked on various aspects of evidence-informed policymaking. For example, on skills and capacity building, increasing policy impact of science, the roles of values and identities in evidence-informed policymaking. And she also co-edited the Science for Policy handbook. From these topics, you can already see probably that her research interests lie in things like research governance, research impact, and the science policy society interface. Her PhD work also relates to the recognition and rewards debates and focuses on studying new tools used in research evaluation, particularly those which aim to capture wider notions of research quality, excellence, and impact. So she is, as you can see, sort of a perfect commentator, not just for our today's talk, but for the whole series that we're having this semester. And our main speaker today is, as I said, Stephan Curry, and he's a professor of structural biology at the Department of Life Sciences of Imperial College in London. He served in a number of capacities at the university that I'm not all going to list, some of them relating especially to undergraduate and postgraduate degrees and programs in biochemistry. His research interest, his main research interest probably, I don't know how your time is divided up nowadays, but lies in problems related to protein-drug interactions and the replication of RNA viruses, which is timely during a pandemic probably, but is not what brought you here. We're not talking about biology and infections today. But he has had a number of activities in teaching and research that relate to the wider role of science in society, science policy, research and development funding, research evaluation, and in scholarly publications. He is very active in public engagement and has written extensively about science and the scientific life. Both in scientific as well as non-scientific media, which is very nice. And what is probably most prominent for us here in this discussion that we're having today and had over the last meetings is that he is the chair of the Declaration of Research Assessment, short DORA, and is also part of the follow-up TARA project that tries to find ways of implementing and moving forward with sort of the things that DORA envisions, but not really does in and of itself, but which has to be done. So these are the things I can say about our speakers today. I'm very happy that they're here, both of them. And I now give the floor to you, Stephan, and I'm very excited about your talk.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that introduction. And good afternoon, everybody in the room. I'm so pleased that people turned up in the room, but also a warm welcome to everybody who is joining us online. I'm very happy for this session to be interactive. I know we have a lot of time for questions and answers. I hope to wrap up my talk in 45 minutes, but I want to be kept to time on that. So please do keep an eye on the clock for me. I can't see students asking questions online, but if somebody does want to interrupt with a question, I'm happy to stop and pick something up if that is possible. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I love coming to Berlin. It's the second time I've been where I actually had some time to visit the city, and I very much enjoyed spending time here actually this weekend. And it's a great honor actually to be at this very famous Humboldt-University here in Berlin. I'm a big fan of Humboldt, as you will see. I have been learning about him in recent years. But today, what I want to talk about, and the question I have been given, is how can good research be evaluated? And really, before we can address that question, we have to really think about, well, how do we know if anything is any good? And so I thought I would start with this painting by Caravaggio, which is one of my favorites, and I think it's very good. And actually, I've never seen this picture in person. It sits in Potsdam, in the picture gallery at the Sanssouci Palace, which is not open between the months of November and April. And I have been to Berlin twice now, once in November and now once again in January, so I have still not seen it. But nevertheless, I still think it is an excellent picture. I'm a bit traditional, perhaps, in my approach to art. I completely admire the skill at depicting a scene realistically. Obviously, Caravaggio is well known for the chiaroscuro technique that he really pioneered. And of course, this picture, the incredulity of St. Thomas, depicts a famous biblical scene, but it can be appreciated and valued on many different levels, even if you're not religious or not Christian. Obviously, this is Doubting Thomas. It can be appreciated on different levels. Might be considered a patron saint of science and scholarship, since he is a highly skeptical individual and asked to see the wound in Christ's side. But the other layer of it that I really appreciate is the interaction between the people in the picture. And particularly the way that the power dynamic is neutralized. On the left, we have the figure of Christ, God walking on earth, and on the right, a mere human being who doubts the word of God. And yet, rather than strike him down with a lightning bolt or drop him dead on the spot, he gently takes his hand and, in order to satisfy his doubt, his skepticism, places his finger inside the wound. And so there's a kindness, a generosity here to the dialogue that is happening, that is one of the aspects of this picture that I really like. And I think that approach to dialogue and to debate, particularly around contentious subjects, such as research evaluation, which can be very noisy at times, is something that we, I think, need to remember from time to time, because sometimes these debates can get quite fractious. But we still have the problem of figuring out how anything is any good. And so we might perhaps take an example from one of the world's best known scientists, Charles Darwin. And this is a photograph that I took actually because I live quite near where Darwin spent most of his life, at the little village of Down in Kent. And this is his notebook, and he's deciding, if you look on the left, it says marry, and on the right it says not marry. And he is trying to decide as a young man whether or not he should get married. And so he lists the pros and cons. So he might be blessed with children. He might acquire an object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog anyhow. He was ultimately very devoted to his good lady wife, but that's an odd comparison to make. The charms of music and female chit-chat, but on the downside, then there are things he would miss out on: the conversation of men at clubs, be forced to visit relatives that he perhaps didn't get on with, and then have all the expense and anxiety that comes from children. And he did suffer greatly. He lost one of his darling daughters at the tender age of 10, and it was a very devastating experience for him. But this is one approach to figuring out how things are good or not, is you list the pros and cons, and then you make a decision about whether or not the cons outweigh the pros, or vice versa. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to go about evaluating things. And often when we're evaluating things, particularly in science, we talk about this concept of excellence. Excellence is what we are looking for. And this brings us to a small connection between Darwin and Humboldt. Darwin was the junior in the relationship. Humboldt was the senior and well-known scientist. And Darwin sent him a copy of his first book, The Voyage of the Beagle, which he completed shortly after returning from his 5-year voyage around South America and the Galapagos that really made his name. Humboldt was delighted to get it and praised the book and said it was excellent and admirable, and then wrote to Darwin, who was delighted to get the letter, "You have an excellent future ahead of you." And this idea of excellence is, of course, something that we think is wholly admirable and something that we should aspire to. There's no question, I think, in terms of thinking about excellent research. But it is a concept that has come under critical analysis recently, and I think there are a number of problems with it that smarter people than myself have helped identify. And so this paper particularly I would highly recommend, and is the one that I recommended to the students in advance of this lecture. So Excellence Iris, University Research and the Fetishization of Excellence. And so this is a very interesting analysis by a range of different scholars from different fields, interrogating the concept of excellence and finding ultimately that it's a rather empty concept. It has no intrinsic meaning. And that is because people find it a difficult concept to define. And so ultimate, combined with narratives of scarcity and competition, and what working scholar or scientist doesn't feel the heat of competition these days, it shows that the concept of excellence actually helps to give rise to this sense of hyper competition that arises from the what we're actually ultimately judging in many cases is the performance of excellence and not the actual quality of the research in and of itself. And actually this enactment or this incorporation of the vague notion of excellence into our practices around research assessment is contributing then to the qualities of good research. It's degrading our research culture, and they can trace, the authors claim, the use of this concept to issues such as reproducibility, fraud, and homophily. And the paper goes into some detail. I'm not going to go into all of it, but it does raise the problem of peer review, which of course is a commonly used method, and one that I would absolutely defend. I do think there is value in peer review, but as we all know, there are issues with it. And we know that even the practice of peer review as currently performed, it can't reliably judge, future citations or future impact. It struggles, as many studies have shown, it struggles to identify errors and fraud. And there are many biases that are associated with peer review that, because it is a very closed and hidden process in many cases, then are difficult actually to unearth. So it's not just one paper that's criticizing excellence. There are other issues, and particularly when one then thinks about the impact on equality and diversity within the academy, which is something that we still do struggle to advance. Then there's this very interesting paper from Marieke van der Brink and Yvonne Benschop, which identifies excellence actually as a rather gendered concept. So as with the Moore et al. Paper that I've just talked about, again, they suggest that people talk about excellence, but they can't really define it. Most interviewees were not able to provide a clear description of excellence, instead saying that, I know it when I see it. Which is not a very precise criteria for making an assessment of a scholar or a piece of research. But often when they talked about excellence, the things that they mentioned were things like an outstanding reputation, someone who was a strong but facilitating manager. And some of these attributes are more closely associated with men than with women. Women are not valued in our society for being strong or being assertive. They associate it with having an international network, but again, there's a gender element comes into there because it is easier for carefree men to attend international conferences where one can network and build one's reputation than it is for women who still assume a disproportionate burden of childcare and other family responsibilities. Someone who is willing to work in excess of full-time hours. And again, that will advantage someone who is relatively carefree, which still in our society is more likely to be a man than a woman. A third article questioning the issue with excellence is by Sarah Clavero and Yvonne Galligan, and again speaks to this issue of epistemic justice, and again raises the issue that, since we don't really define excellence, it's very often in the eye of the beholder, and the beholder, who is the judge and making the assessment, again, is often the dominant population within the academy, and in Europe, certainly, then that would tend to be white, able-bodied men. And so that enactment of excellence within research assessment then leads to, as the previous paper showed, then issues with bias that can undermine the contributions of minoritized groups, which include women and people from ethnic minorities, and even disabled staff and students. So going back to Moore's paper, okay, if we're not going to use excellence, then what else can we do? And they advise, or they recommend and make the argument that actually thinking about soundness and capacity over excellence is a better basis on which to construct a framework for research assessment. And in particular, the idea that sound research is good research is something that is politically saleable, and we must also, of course, be aware of making the argument in the political sphere about the value of research and the reason that it should continue to be funded. And so the focus should be on the different dimensions of the quality of research. So thoroughness, completeness, using appropriate standards of description, appropriate use of evidence, probity, rather than flashy claims of superiority. And so they are moving now to, rather than thinking about a relatively ill-defined concept, what is excellence, then thinking about a concept that actually is more easy to define and to define criteria for it. Now, I think there is an awful lot of merit in that approach, but I think many people will say, well, hang on a minute, excellence is still something that we think is valuable. We want really good quality research. What you're not measuring here by measuring thoroughness or completeness is, how mind-blowing was this piece of work? How impactful was it? Does it change the way that we think about this whole field? That is something that we still want to be able to evaluate. But I think we have to have the humility to understand that that is not something that we can easily put on a numerical scale, and it is not something that we can compare when we compare achievements in physics with achievements in English literature or German literature even. So, and the solution, I think, to this debate and this conundrum, we can find again in Darwin, just to sort of close the little loop that I opened up in my introduction. There's this famous passage from the end of On the Origin of Species, where he contemplates an entangled bank, and he looks at all the variety that has arisen through evolution, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. And I think if we think about what research is and what scholarship is, then there are endless forms most beautiful within research. It's not just the book and the published paper, not just the idea, but it's the way that it was conducted, the rigor that was brought to it, and even within the conduct of a lab-based research, then the quality of the mentoring and collaborations that were sustained or needed to be developed in order to deliver a particular result. So we want to broaden our conceptions and think about the different qualities of things. And this takes me, I hope this isn't too obscure an excursion, and again, partly reflects my own recent reading, but I'm very much taken with the liberal philosophy of, I was going to say Irving Berlin, but Isaiah Berlin. Irving Berlin was also an excellent person, but more noted for his musical composition. So Isaiah Berlin was a historian of ideas and a philosopher, very much a philosopher who's associated with the developing sort of liberal ideology. But he was critical, I think, of many of the ideas that arose first in the Enlightenment, this idea that there were a core set of human values that could be derived from the study of human nature. And he felt that really wasn't the case. They could not be securely derived just by studying human nature, values. And of course, he's talking about political values here, but we can, I think, talk about values in any sphere, what we think is valuable. They are historical, and they are very much relative to the cultures that have engendered them. And often they are contradictory and in conflict. and expanding on that idea, when we are making decisions, political choices, or any choice, whether or not to publish this or that paper, whether or not to fund this or that grant application, of course, there will be loss involved, but actually, which of course, because the losers will be the people who don't get published or don't get funded, but even within the choice, considering multiple dimensions of quality, one has to then make a choice about which aspects one is going to place a higher value on, because often you are comparing across non-comparable endeavors, but a choice has to be made because the pot is finite. But in the political sphere, as Berlin puts it, loss was inevitable because values are in conflict and because human reason was incorrigibly imperfect. And again, I think often when we talk about research assessment, there is this vague notion for some that there is a right answer out there. We can judge paper X versus paper Y by objective criteria. And I don't think that that is actually possible. And I think we have to recognize that fundamentally we're making a human judgment. In such a judgment, reason can certainly clarify the facts and absolutely should be brought to bear. But ultimately, a choice is being made, which is an act of will, perhaps also an act of instinct and emotion, and who hasn't seen that around a grant panel for some time. And as such, a gamble made in the dark. And I think, again, when we are talking about research assessment, we are making gambles based on probabilities, and we should be open and transparent about that. And for Berlin, then, a free society was a good society because it accepted this conflict. And I think, therefore, a freer academy will be a good academy if, again, we acknowledge this conflict, this plurality of values and different aspects that we recognize. But of course, we have got ourselves into a position, and perhaps this is particularly the fault of biomedical scientists like myself, where we rely overmuch on certain kinds of metrics when it comes to evaluating research. And certainly over the past 20 years, though nobody designed the system deliberately, but we have assumed and assigned a value to journal impact factors and to university league tables, that I think if one looks at the methodologies behind these are simply not merited. And we know and have seen, and I'm not going to go into chapter and verse in this, but evaluation based that relies too heavily on journal metrics, it reduces productivity because it means that people chase publication in the highest impact journal that they can get and then work their way down the hierarchy as they try to get publication. And obviously there's a positive bias in the literature because journals are only really interested in publishing positive results. Negative results, they suspect, will not be cited and therefore will penalize the journal's impact factor. And so that competition for journal pages and of course good publication records are necessary to maintain good funding records, then that drives a sort of a hyperloop of competition. And it creates a culture, I think, largely in which only the result matters. And we excuse a lot of bad behavior as long as people are performing well by the metrics that we are using to determine quality or excellence. It tends, in many cases, to devalue other important activities, particularly at universities, one of which would, of course, be teaching of undergraduates and postgraduates. And it really focuses our culture on the what, not the who and the how. And I think we have lost sight of that, and we need to regain a focus on the how we do things and who is involved in that and how they are included. And there are many stories and data analyses that link the overuse of metrics to fraud. The one thing that correlates most strongly with the journal impact factor is the journal retraction rate. And we have internalized it as well. So the things in the speech bubbles, those are actual quotes from real people that I spoke to. One is a dean of a faculty at a well-known London university, not my own, but I'm not going to name it. Our people know how to get the Nature papers, okay? Or then a young postdoc who was really excited. She had just had a big paper in Cell. That was the first thing she wanted to tell me was the name of the journal. It wasn't to tell me about, why the result itself, what was it about? Why was it so exciting? What had they learned that we didn't know before? And this, we have internalized this metricized process. And this gives rise to, some pretty serious problems. There's a link here, and I'm happy for these slides to be shared, and the links should all work afterwards. So this is a YouTube video of a talk given by Thomas Insel, who ran the National Institute for Medical Health Research in the United States for 13 years. And in that time, he spent $20 billion, and he thinks we did publish some pretty cool papers, but I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, or improving the recovery of the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. And so we have an incentive system that is overly focused on the rewards that accrue to those who publish in the right journals, and is not thinking quite so much about the ultimate purpose, perhaps, of the research. Now, of course, in mental health research, then clearly there is an outcome and a patient audience that has to be thought of, but we are perhaps not doing enough to think of them. Now, at the same time, I'm not arguing that we should only fund applied research, okay? We should only think about curing cancer or curing mental health. As I said before, I don't want to kick the idea of excellence out of the academy forever. I think it is important, and I think one of the things that is exciting about being a scholar or a scientist is actually sharing in the wonder of just the amazing things that people find out about the world. And these are a couple of papers that I came across because I asked people on Twitter, what was the paper last year that was published that knocked their socks off, that just made them go, wow. Okay, so I'm very thankful to Johan Rourke for this suggestion. So this is a paper, I think, asserting that monolingualism, which is the social practice of just enforcing people to learn one language, is actually a body modification on a par with the practice of foot binding that was practiced in Chinese societies a long time ago. And actually what it does is atrophy your innate ability to learn to be multilingual, in fact. But this was a new way of looking at his field, which is linguistics. This one is more to do with mine, and it's about how the codons that's used to encode a particular amino acid affects the fold of a protein. It's not just the amino acid, but it's the codon that's used to fold it, which is a completely out there observation. Who knows if it'll turn out to be true, but it was a really exciting thing to read, and of course I think well worth being published, on something that should be celebrated. But we still have a problem of a system, I think, that is out of balance. And this is a quote from Frank Miedema. Now, Frank is a health science researcher. He works on HIV viruses, but has done an awful lot of work in the Netherlands to push a movement called Science in Transition, which has really helped to, and as many of you or some of you will know, there's actually a whole national program of rethinking research assessment. Maybe you've had some speakers who have linked to that program in that. Oh, our esteemed chair for today, for one. But Frank is a pretty outspoken guy, but he knows his stuff. But and he recognizes that many people come into a career in scholarship or in science for the most noble of intentions. They want to change the world. They want to understand the world better. They want to cure diseases, but the system tends to grind it out of them because researchers find themselves pursuing not the work that benefits the public or patients, but the work that gives them most academic credit. And that is the system that we've got out of balance. And that academic credit, often it's talked of in terms of journal impact factors or journal prestige. But I find that many people don't actually really understand what the impact factor is, or what it actually means, or how it's calculated. It is in effect a crude arithmetic mean of the number of citations that the papers in a particular journal have accrued over the past 2 years. And in different journals, of course, they have different impact factors. But that single number characterizes a distribution that has this skewed shape for basically every journal that has ever been published. Nature has a GIF of about 40, whereas PLOS One has a GIF of about 3, or it did in 2016. And so you'll see that Nature has many more papers that have higher numbers of citations, which is why there are higher bars that go out to the right here. But for a single journal, the impact factor is roughly at this position in the distribution. And actually, most papers published in that journal, 65 to 70% of them, actually have fewer citations than would be indicated by the average citation that a journal would seem to give them. by publishing in that venue. So there's a huge range of performance. Now, the editor of Nature, I think, would defend the papers that they published that only get 1 or 2 citations because they thought they were good enough to publish in Nature. But okay, that may be the editor of Nature thinks that, but lots of other people then make the assumption that if it's in Nature, therefore it's, you know, it's a really great paper. And so, but ultimately the impact factor itself is a poor indicator of the number of citations for any given paper. At best, as far as I can make out, it gives you a crude probability about, you know, how many citations a given article might get because it's in a particular journal, but it's a very crude measure. If you actually look at data, and so these are data for 4 individual researchers, and we're plotting the number of citations that their papers got, and then this is on the horizontal axis is the impact factor of the journal that they published in. So each dot is a paper for them. Now there is a correlation, and a positive correlation between the number of citations and the journal impact factor, but they're not very good. It's the strongest perhaps for researcher in the bottom right here, it's 0.63, but you see there's a lot of noise here. Sometimes people get the highest number of citations in the highest impact factor journal that they published in, but that is not always the case, as we see here. So it's very stochastic. And is it fair to judge people based on a very crude probability? I think it's a much better and a more robust practice to judge people on what they've actually done. Now, one can look at citation counts, and this, just want to point out, so this paper is, you know, it's over 25 years old now, so this was published in 1997. Here's a paper published 20 years before that, so it's nearly 45, nearly 50 years old, and even then, a statistical analysis found that impact factor alone was examined to determine its usefulness as a predictor of judged importance, but was found to be only slightly better than a random choice would have been. Okay, so it gives you a probability, but it's not a very secure probability. And again, here is another analysis from 2000. And again, looking at, so it's looking at citation counts for papers. So we're moving slightly away from impact factor. And a citation count, of course, is a metric that attaches to a particular piece of work. And they do find that generally important papers do end up being highly cited. And so this, for example, shows an example of papers from 1950 to 1974. And so the black squares are papers that are judged to be important. This is working in astrophysics, and they got 53 senior astronomers to identify what they thought were the best papers in their field in this interval between 1950 and 1974. But what you will see is that there actually are some white squares in there as well. So just because a paper has a lot of citations doesn't necessarily mean that it is considered valuable. So even the citation count itself is an interesting piece of data, but not one that should be used blindly or thoughtlessly. So we have an issue with journal impact factors. There is, I think, an argument to be made that it's having a degrading effect on our research culture. But I think one of the key questions that we have, and that crops up, I think, time and time again in this debate, is how serious is the problem? Okay, we have identified a problem. Dora, whom I'm representing here today, has been going for 10 years talking about, you know, there is an issue here. We do need to think about reforming research assessment. And there are many people who say that actually the system, it's not perfect, but it is still working pretty well. You know, we are getting good papers published, good research, good scholarship is still getting done and is still getting recognized. So how bad is the problem? And the answer to that question, I think, partly depends on who you are. This is a polemical piece written by Dan Sarowitz in 2016, which I would highly recommend to you, which actually takes a rather stiff view of the current state of science. Science is not self-correcting, it's self-destructing. And to save the enterprise, scientists must come out of the lab and into the real world. And it's making an argument for the management of research projects. And actually, a couple of the cases that he mentions are cases where the military in the United States came in and managed, for example, a vaccine development program. And they just got things done because they were the army and they knew how to do things. And so what Sarowitz is frustrated by is this notion, I can try and move this, maybe not, much of the problem can be traced to this bald-faced lie that scientific progress rests on a broad front. And this is a quotation from, or a paraphrasing a quotation from Vannevar Bush, who was a senior government official in the United States shortly after the Second World War, where there was a huge surge in scientific investment because they had seen that during the war, then that had produced results that really mattered to them. But there was, I think, a great deal of respect then still for the scientific and scholarly community. And so they were to be allowed the free play of intellects working on subjects of their own choice in a manner dictated by their curiosity. And Sarowitz is frustrated by this, partly linking it to our obsession with impact factors and journal prestige, means that people are really focused, as Medina has criticized, with focused on publishing papers, and that being the unit of productivity, and that means then that an awful lot of papers are, and particularly he even criticized a lot of biomedical research is done in mice as an early study, but then it's not actually carried forward into a system that is obviously of more relevance to human beings. Now, Sarowitz's article made me very cross when I first read it, and I was one of the people who wrote a response to it. But actually, as I read it again and again, I am in more sympathy with Sarowitz. I think he overplays his hand a bit, but what is wouldn't have been a good polemic if he hadn't overplayed his hand a bit. But I'm a much more reasonable kind of person, and I do recognize that there certainly are issues, and polemic is a great method for stirring debate, but a poor one for resolution, in my view. And so I do think we need to proceed by respecting the evidence, acknowledging our limitations, and that's really one of my watchwords, and renewing our determination to improve the connection between science and the world beyond the laboratory walls. And I think that connection is an important one, has to be two-way. It's not an argument that all science has to find a use or a utility in the real world, or the world outside the university, but actually that science and society interact in very potentially interesting and productive ways, and that we do need to be more open and more transparent about what we're doing, I think, if we are going to think about our limitations. But if we are to answer the question, well, how bad is the problem, and therefore how serious do the solutions have to be? Then we have to sort of think about, well, how is it that we figure out a dialogue that enables change? Now, I quite enjoyed Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists. He says, if you want to change the world, you have to be unrealistic, unreasonable, and impossible. And there are people, that's the way that they have changed the world, okay? They have not stood for the status quo, and you absolutely need people in the vanguard like that who will not take no for an answer, or will not take compromise for an answer either. Psychologically and philosophically, I'm a little bit more in tune with Atul Gawande, who's a thoracic surgeon and public health researcher, and just a wonderful writer. And there's a great piece in the New Yorker here called Slow Ideas about how you change people's minds. And he writes, we yearn for frictionless technological solutions, and that's what many people would like to have for research assessment. But it's people talking to people is still how the world's standards change. But in that dialogue, you do need to be able to speak to the people who want to be unreasonable, unrealistic, and impossible. And there are no shortage of those working in academia right now. We have seen actually in the Netherlands the changes that are coming down, which do have national momentum. Some of them have been introduced by some bolder universities, Utrecht University being one of them. And this has raised pretty fiery objections from a certain segment of the professoriate, one being a certain Professor Put. And so Utrecht has basically announced that they're not going to use journal impact factors in their assessments. And Professor Put was very upset about this and thought that it would ultimately lead to randomness and compromising of scientific quality. Professor Sarah de Rijke, who's at the University of Leiden, actually at the CWTS as well, and is a good friend of Dora, sort of comments in counterpoint that really the real issue is that we should unlearn the unhelpful shortcuts and proxies and relearn how to undertake in-depth contextual evaluation. So we do want to think more carefully. The shortcuts are nice and they're handy, and some people still believe in them, but I don't think there's a good argument to be made for retaining their use. Nevertheless, if we are going to advance and make real change, it's not just about grandstanding and saying, isn't the world terrible? Thank you very much. My speech is over. It's really about, how do we actually change the world? Now, there's no shortage of visions for a better world in research assessment and in open research, which is often tightly linked to it. DORA came out in May 2013. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary later this year, but there have been many, many reports that have analyzed this problem, and some of them have started to offer solutions. And I'm particularly heartened by the recent European Commission scoping report, which was one of the preliminary documents for the basis of the new coalition on the reform of research assessment, which I'll mention again in a moment. And actually, even on the international stage, then UNESCO has a very powerful document on recommendations for open science, which talk in great detail about the importance of linking progress there to research assessment and opening up the academy so that we can do that even better. Now, we have no shortage of visions, and DORA, along with the rest of them, we have a vision of our own about what quality research looks like: reliable, rapidly communicated, accessible, high quality research, researchers who collaborate, who feel a duty of care to group members and a responsibility to society, and a system that values the people within it and that seeks out the creative vigor of diversity. Okay, now I will readily admit that is a vision, not a solution. Okay, and that is a utopian idea and not the reality on the ground right now, no matter how many people might agree with us. And so we do, if we are going to really make change, and we have to actually recognize there's a complex problem going on here. And our vision for a reform of research assessment, we have to recognize that actually that's intersecting with other movements that we see within the academy now, not least open scholarship, and there are interactions here because both of them are thinking in new ways about the various qualities and varieties of output and activity and process that we should be valuing in research assessment. But also we know that research assessment is one of these points where biases creep in, which results in the exclusion of large numbers of people from the academy. And so we lose their contribution, most notably, of course, women. My university, fewer than 20% of our professors are women. Okay, across Europe, it's about 25% or 27% perhaps. And so we are just wasting a massive amount of talent that could otherwise be contributing and bringing in different perspectives. Of course, ethnic minorities in the UK, we know, for example, that there are many particular ethnic minority communities who are underserved in the academy and who therefore don't have a voice, and whose perspective on the world and what it might be and what science might achieve is lost to us. But again, a vision is not enough. We need tools and we need an action plan, okay? And the work that I do on equality and diversity at Imperial College, we don't get anything done unless actually we've got an action plan. My esteemed colleague in HR says, what gets measured gets done. Okay, and if you have got a plan and a commitment and the senior leadership has signed up for it, and you can wave it under their nose and saying, we're not doing this, you said we were going to do it, you can actually start to get things done. But who's going to come up with that plan and that action plan for research assessment? Because our community is, of course, so distributed, not just within any one country, but of course, across Europe and across the world. Now, DORA is one part of that, and we are doing our best. We are a small organization. Those of you who are familiar with DORA will know that it's actually a declaration, but these days also in the last 5 or 6 years, thanks to funding from a number of different organizations, we actually have a small staff, so we are also a small organization as well. We have 2 full-time members of staff and 2 policy associates, and that's everyone else, myself and the rest of the steering committee. We work voluntarily. So DORA is best known for being critical of the use of impact factors, but actually the declaration is much longer than that and actually has 17 positive recommendations, encouraging people to think about, judge people on what they've done rather than where they've published, and think about the content rather than the cover, and also think more broadly about the different contributions that people make and things that we want to value, such as good mentorship, for example. We have made a very determined effort to be worldwide in our perspective, and we have reconstituted our steering group. So we actually have representatives from every single continent on the planet. And that's really been very valuable to us to get that perspective around the table, because often these movements are dominated by Europeans and Americans. And we have a strategy, and the main goal for the strategy really is about developing and promoting best practice in research assessment. Now, there's a number of different ways that we've been doing that. Some of it is by writing articles and briefings and collating various tools. We have a resource library of stuff that we've created and stuff that other institutions and funders, policy documents, guidance, good practice case studies, for example. And that is available to us. But we also collaborate widely with many other groups in order to try and advance this program. One of the tools that we have developed is this SPACE rubric, which we offer to institutions, and it's a way of sort of assessing, where you are on your research assessment reform journey and how you might go about identifying the obstacles to that. And there are many to be identified, and many of them will be cultural and organizational. But we're not the only game in town at all. This iNorms has a scope framework, which is about starting right from the beginning, and the first step is to start with what you value. And so the emphasis here is very much on co-creation. So you do that internally. You don't just get the university vice chancellor to write down what they think are important. You work with the community, and then you develop a framework, identify the potential obstacles within it, and then at the end of the cycle, then you evaluate, is it having the impact that you really think it should be having? Hopefully, you're creating a happier and more productive research community within your institution. And then this third document is called Research Quality Plus, and that's developed by the Canadian research funder, and that's particularly focused on how one evaluates research that's focused on activities within the developing world, because not everybody has to be a Caltech or a Harvard or an Oxford or a Cambridge. One of the tools that we have advocated strongly for and helped to try and promote, and one that actually has roots in this fair city as well, because the Charité University Hospital in Berlin has developed and adopted its own version of this tool, is the narrative CV. And this is something that does seem to be gaining momentum. It's now, the Royal Society developed a version called the Resume for Researchers, in which they ask applicants for funding or fellowships to identify their contributions to the generation of knowledge, to the development of individuals, to the wider research community, to their discipline, and then to broader society. In the Charité Hospital, it's your contribution to your field, what you think are your 5 most important papers, your contribution to open science, and then how you have developed important collaborations. And we offer as a replacement for over-reliance on metrics. And there are many funding institutions. I know that the Science Foundation Ireland has adopted this, the Swiss National Science Foundation has adopted it as well. And the Royal Society version has now been adopted within the UK by CoARA, which is the government arm of research and development funding. The attractions for it, for me, are that it is a concise format, so you can just say, it can just be a 2-page thing if you control the format appropriately. It's values-based and based on the values that your organization and the activities think is most important, and that might vary from university to university. It's structured in a very particular way, and so although much of the information is qualitative, you are then at least getting the answers to the same questions from all of the applicants, and that does facilitate comparison of one candidate versus the other. It is still evidence-based. One of the criticisms I have heard, and we have run workshops trying to analyze and tease apart the criticisms and the weaknesses, because it's not a silver bullet, I'm afraid. There are no silver bullets in this game. But one can bring metric and quantitative information to me. If your citation count is high, and that's an indicator that your paper really has set the field alight, then go, knock your socks off and include that information in it. It's not just about making stuff up. And of course, it has to be developed and used with care. And what the Swiss National Foundation has found is that the panel members and all the applicants as well need training and guidance on how best to use this format. But again, one other aspect is that it does allow one to look at the different qualities of research. It's not just looking at some ill-defined notion of excellence. You're looking at, you know, how exciting are the papers? You know, tell us about what you think is your most important paper and why. Tell us about how, you know, how much importance you attach to good mentorship, to good departmental citizenship within your university, for example. So, as I've mentioned in the uptake of this narrative CV, then funders do have quite a bit of power in doing this because they pay the money. So to a degree, they can maybe make the rules. And so their adoption of this format, I think, tells us that they really are on board with promoting what we call responsible research assessment. And this was, we define in a paper that was published in 2020, which Dora collaborated on with folks at UKRI and the Research on Research Institute, which is based in London. So responsible research assessment we regard as an umbrella term for approaches to assessment which incentivize, reflect, and reward the plural characteristics of high quality research in support of diverse and inclusive research cultures. And again, there's a focus on culture there, which is very much aimed at trying to detoxify the harmful effects that our current practices of research evaluation have got in. And just, I'm going to wrap up now, but a recent piece of work that I was involved in is a revisiting of this report, The Metric Tide, which was commissioned in 2015 by the UK government, but had a deep look at research evaluation practices. It was, they requested as a way of thinking about how the so-called research excellence framework, which is run in the UK. You might be grateful that you don't work in the UK because basically every single university department is assessed. It happens about every 6 or 7 years and consumes an awful lot of attention. You are scored on the quality of your submitted research papers, typically 2.5 papers per member of your staff in your department. 15% is for the quality of the research environment. How well do you foster collaborations? And then 25% is for real world impact. And it's currently done on a sort of mixed mode method. It's largely qualitative information. And so the papers that are submitted are peer reviewed. And we were asked to have a look 7 years down the line at whether or not the system had really changed, whether innovations in metrics that might mean that you could use metrics more and reduce the burden. It's really not clear yet that that could be done, but there is potential scope for it. But what was interesting when the three of us who did this work, I worked with Lizzie Gadd at Loughborough and James Wilson he's now at UCL and Rory, or the Research on Research Institute. But looking back, we saw that, you know, over the past 7 years, you know, people had absorbed some of the lessons of the Metric Tide and other important documents like Dora and the Leiden Manifesto. But actually, it wasn't really clear, I think, within the university communities that change was, you know, happening. And so there needs to be more transparency about that. And there isn't sufficient involvement of the evaluated in the development of research assessment practices. So that is something that we would recommend that, you know, needs to be changed. People still want metrics, okay? They still want easy answers. And who wouldn't want easy answers to difficult questions, okay? It's a very natural thing to want or to wish for, but we still think mixed methods combining qualitative and quantitative information is best. We recommended that more weight be put on the environment statements as a way of tackling culture and as a way of incentivizing good, high quality processes and behavior within the academy. And so think about using data for good, you know, so look at, you know, evaluate universities on how well they are addressing gender inequality, whether or not they have effective policies for dealing with sexual misconduct, which is often brushed under the carpet for the sake of, you know, burnishing one's research profile. Of course, the burden of a research assessment remains an issue, and particularly for the REF, because it's a very, or the Research Excellence Framework, it is seen as very burdensome by many university administrators and staff. And also that, you know, despite Brexit, we hope that Britain will remain engaged with the rest of the world and the rest of Europe and engage constructively in international reform efforts. And one of the most important of these, of course, is the recent CoARA initiative that has been spearheaded by Science Europe and the European Universities Association, but with the blessing of the European Commission, which is actually getting universities together to really think through the hard work of how they are going to tackle the challenge of research assessment, and we do wish them well in that endeavor. So I think I've overrun my 45 minutes, but I hope I stimulated some thought, and I'm very happy to take questions and to hear from my chair.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was actually, I think, very easy now to ask quite a number of questions, because it was a wide range of topics that you covered. And but the first one to speak and to be able to comment will be Marta Sienkiewicz, and I just hand whatever that is, I hand over to you digitally. It's for you to speak now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for the floor and for the invitation. I'm really, really pleased to be able to offer a couple of reflections. And thank you, Stephen, for this excellent and inspiring talk. I really enjoyed it, and I hope a couple of reflections from me will also help frame the discussion further. My first point would be a little bit of a high-level one, which is related to the way we frame the conversation when we talk about the assessment reform. So this is not per se a criticism of how you discuss that, but rather a wider issue. So of course, we talk about the research assessment reform specifically, and we leave out other activities that are, of course, the bread and butter of academia as well. And we might, of course, argue in some way that this is a bit of a placeholder term, the research assessment reform, and that there are various diverse understandings of what research activities might mean. And in addition, of course, you coming from the UK, you mentioned that the ref also involves aspects like non-academic impact and collaboration. So in itself, when in that term of research, there is some room for diversity. But I still think that this prioritization of research, of talking about research in the assessment reform, as opposed to perhaps academic assessment or some sort of another term, I think that speaks to a certain inequality that exists between different types of activities that academics are engaged in. And I think it also, it relates to a different level at which we value these different activities, which to me speaks to what you were talking about when it comes to the system being out of balance and the system not necessarily promoting activities that would lead to more benefit for society. So I think in a way that's perhaps a bit at odds that we talk about research assessment might be at odds with sort of realizing the wider functions of universities. And I can offer a sort of different way of looking at it coming from the Dutch context. So in the Netherlands, with the recognition and rewards reform, there is a very explicit move from focusing assessments only on research quality towards more talking about academic quality, and really adding very explicitly the additional pillars next to research that are to be recognized and valued and visible in the assessment. So in the Dutch context, this is teaching and non-academic impact, leadership, and also patient care for those that do medical research. And I think that is sort of an interesting way, perhaps, of looking at it. But I also find it surprising that with the even with the global initiatives, the one that you also mentioned, the CoARA, the EU initiative, that focus on research still remains, and the others are sort of left invisible. So my question to you would be perhaps why that is, or what are your thoughts on whether we should be widening that scope, also in light with your arguments about the system being out of balance and the incentives. The second reflection that I would like to offer is about the excellence being really a difficult a difficult concept to try to eradicate or to try to rebalance. I do agree with you that it is one that is difficult to properly define, and the researchers themselves struggle with, you know, the kind of core definition. But I do think that as a policy concept and as a governance concept and governance reality, it does have these connotations that are not only quite clear, such as the competition, the quantification, the accumulation. I think these are the qualities that make, or rather the characteristics of that excellence regime that make that regime quite totalizing. I think it's something that has left the environment of research evaluation and really has spilled over into research culture, into what we think, or what often people think good research is, and what we should value and what we should aim for, etc. So I think in that sense, it has a lot of power. And I think there's one aspect of it that maybe we are not criticizing enough, or maybe it's not visible enough in our conversations. So we challenge excellence, we challenge over quantification and metricization, but I'm wondering if we challenge enough the notions of accumulation, and really the focus on having, especially for individuals, I think, on accumulating this competitive edge and always having a bit more than the others, and focusing on what can build the credit and the currency that can build people's careers. I think that especially in the context in which people are compared, and in which they are in this high competition, those who accumulate might have this critical advantage. So I'm sort of curious, and I'm posing this question more as a exercise in imagination. Can we drop that idea of, can we somehow escape this logic of accumulation, both in assessments but also in academic practice? Because I think that even if we change assessments, there is probably a certain delay with which the slower change in culture happens. And finally, I wanted to pick up on this point, on the point that you made about the need to focus more on the process as opposed to outputs, and I really like the point that you made, that when we do assessments, we really focus on, we really pick certain values that we want to make core, and we want for them to be applied in assessments. But I'm still wondering, when it comes to assessing process, what sort of how to approach the material aspect of it. So how to approach the procedures and the tools for which we could be indeed for which we could be making the process visible. So perhaps I can maybe also go back to some of you were mentioning the tools and some of the examples. Do you think that any of these examples are actually getting at the process part of academic activities, whether they attempt that, whether they do that sufficiently? Because this is where I sympathize with this notion of thinking in very unrealistic and big terms when it comes to reform. But I also find that that plea for more focus on the process to be quite challenging in practical terms. So I'm just curious, what have you perhaps witnessed when it comes to reassessing that in practice and noticing that in practice? I think I will stop at that to make more room as well for questions from students, and really looking forward to the discussion. And thank you again, Stephen, for a great talk.
Thank you very much, Marta. So let me try briefly to answer your three questions. So one was really around the prioritizing of research assessment over other activities. And I think I agree there is a potential tension there. I mean, one of the things perhaps I should have emphasized more in my talk, that is obviously different organizations are assessing different things. So a funder is obviously largely going to be assessing, the research quality and the research performance. of the applicant and their application. Within a university setting, where clearly academics are hired not just to do research, but to educate students, then there's a greater plurality of the sorts of activities that one wants to incentivize. And certainly, when I joined the university where I work, which is more than 25 years ago now, the message, the word on the ground was, you get grants and you publish good papers, okay? And you keep your nose clean and you do a little bit of teaching to keep everybody happy. And actually, over the last 20 years or so, I have seen that change. And so there is much more emphasis now, I think, on recognizing that high quality education is obviously something that is important to universities, but also things like, departmental citizenship. Do you actually help to run the show? Because academia is a very funny business in that it's often run by amateurs and not professionals in many ways, who basically take on lots of jobs that they never really thought that they would have to do. But that helps to keep the show going round. Is research the thing that we always value most? Is that our most important activity? I think perhaps for many scholars, even those that enjoy teaching, they might say that is the thing that they love most. And that is, I imagine there are a few university lecturers and professors who wanted to be a university teacher, and that was their primary motivation. But my sense is, and my personal feeling is that, I came into this life because I wanted time to do research. I recognized the value in education, and I was prepared to do it. But when I was director of undergraduate studies in my department, being a very good departmental citizen, I did have some colleagues who weren't so very interested in doing the education bit. And I said to them, that's fine, but if you want to do that, can you go and get a job at a research institute? Because this is a university, and universities are as much about education as they are about research. So I think there's always going to be a bit of tension there. You're right, I think CoARA is focused on research, but I think that's partly because they are trying to assemble a broad church. So they're not just including universities. And I think ultimately it's up to universities to develop their own frameworks for judging. And that's why the narrative CV format, for example, I think is a good template, because it can be adapted to different organizational missions. In terms of excellence, still having value as a policy concept, I agree to some degree, but I think some of the criticisms and some of the negative impacts of the way that excellence is used, and the papers that I cited, I think do make a powerful case that yes, we are all interested in quality. And I think I took the slide out. My talk was already long enough. But another philosophy book that I would have quoted, which is popular philosophy, is called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Has anybody read it? So it has the record of being the most rejected book manuscript ever. It was rejected 122 times and went on to sell more than 5 million copies. So there's an interesting allegory there about evaluation and whatnot. But one of the key elements of the sort of the philosophy or the philosophical approach within that is that the experience and the involvement in exercise of quality is something that's really important to us as human beings. And so, we do want, I think, and I think this is the nub of the critique, is that having identified that excellence is relatively empty and largely puts the control in the hands of the assessor, who therefore doesn't necessarily have to justify the specific criteria that they are using, it's just an idea of excellence, then that, as we have seen, leads to issues within our research culture that I think we need to address. And I think we can address by identifying and agreeing, or discussing at least, even if we can't agree, because often our values may be in conflict, but we arrive at a determination of, these are the attributes of research or of academic life that we think are important, and we would score people on those specific criteria. So that's the idea of having conceptual clarity about what it is that we are evaluating. And I think excellence allows too many veils to be drawn across what we actually mean. And then finally, in terms of thinking about the process, I agree, it's not trivial necessarily. It's not necessarily easy to do. There are some obvious things around, describing the process or making it more accessible to evaluation. One, for example, would be sharing of research data and code that's used to produce analyses. And so that makes it more transparent. I mean, the whole idea of open access and open scholarship is so that actually data and reports and claims can be tested and scrutinized by a much wider audience than would be under the more traditional publishing process, which relies on subscriptions and where many people simply don't have access. And we saw that actually with the uptake of preprints during the COVID pandemic, then although there was some absolute nonsense was published as preprints about COVID and coronavirus, the really bad stuff was torn apart within 24 hours. And so it's that openness that allows the scrutiny that then helps to build public trust in that kind of process. And within process, I would include, obviously process is only tested if the results can be built upon. And actually that's one of Saravitz's argument, is that technology keeps science honest, because with technology it actually has to work, and if it doesn't work it means that the science was rubbish. I don't think that's a rule or a method that you can apply to every scientific or scholarly insight, but if it can be built upon and we can see how it is built upon, then that allows an evaluation of process. Other aspects, I think one has to drill a little bit more, and I think part of process is behavior, and attitude. And so it's about, is the PI mentoring their students? And one of the, I think in the UK, the Wellcome Trust, which is a big biomedical funder, when you apply for money, they say, tell us about the people who've been in your lab. Where are they now and what are they doing? And that is one way of trying to get an idea of whether or not the PI is concerned about the careers of the early career researchers who come through their lab, or whether they are regarded as disposable infantry. Coming back to the point, sorry, you made a point about, can we challenge accumulation? And I think to some extent, I think, one of the things you were getting at was the Matthew effect, to those that have shall more be given. And I'm speaking as somebody who is in his 60th year as of this year, but accumulation is something that's hard to get away with, and people do build a reputation, and I think many of us in academia, we are jealous of our reputation. Hopefully that is what keeps most of us reasonably honest. Some people like to get a good reputation by fast and unscrupulous means, but most people do not. And I think hopefully if somebody builds a track record of producing good work across several decades, it's not unreasonable to expect that, they have accumulated a few laurels. Maybe they're probably not allowed to rest on them in the current situation. You still have to apply for the money. But of course, that then potentially disadvantages early career researchers. But I do think many funders, they do recognize that, and certainly if you're applying for, as a PhD student or postdoc, one is looking more for promise than for track record and the accumulation of scholarly prestige. But you're right, it's not necessarily an even playing field, but there are some measures that one can use to mitigate that unevenness.